So really an estate is an interest in land. And I do want you to know, I was doing some live streaming the other day, so I'm going to refresh and get a new board here for us. Anytime that we talk about an estate, the word estate, it's an interest in land. And one of the things I want you to know about when we talk about an interest or an estate is we see in the exam what is called freehold, a freehold estate. This, if you just equate ownership, okay? And we have what is called non-freehold, and we get to that later in the course. But non-freehold estate is when we are talking about leases. Now, you need to understand that if a person has a lease, they actually have an estate in land, okay? They have the ability to have quiet enjoyment, to use the property without you coming into the premises. You know, a lot of times I hear about landlords who go in the property when the owners are not there just to make sure that everything looks fine. You can't do some of that stuff. There are lots of laws and things that you have to be careful of. And I've owned lots of rental property. I own rental property today. And sometimes it gets a little crazy because I feel like they have more rights than I do. And I'm thinking, I own the property. You know what they're not paying any rent. And I had a situation one time where the people weren't paying rent and I went to collect the rent and they didn't have the rent. And the next day I get a letter, or 2 days later, from a non-for-profit legal counsel who tells me to stay off the property, that I'm trespassing. And that infuriated me. So I went back down to collect the rent and they didn't have the money and they told me to hit the road. And I'm like, really? You know? And then the police show up at my office. They had filed a report that I beat the lady up in the front yard. And I said, well, first of all, do I look like somebody who would beat up one of my tenants? And the guy knew me from the police department. And I said, secondly, it's on Main Street. Did you receive any phone calls from motorists who said John Mayfield's out there beating up a lady in the front yard? True story. I kid you not. This was a nightmare tenant for me. They knew every trick in the book. And I could not get them out because they had certain rights. Finally got an attorney, went to court. The judge said they had to leave. Well, then I had to wait for the sheriff to go evict them, which was taking time. And finally, I called because I knew they had had their water shut off for non-payment. I called the hotline because they had small children. And I guess the hotline showed up that night, the people from the family services, and they were gone the next morning. They disappeared in the middle of the night. Now, I'm only telling you that story so you'll understand that when you lease property, you have rights. Now, I still have rights as the owner, the freehold estate of that property, but I have to abide by the rights that the government sets on rental property. So can be sometimes kind of discouraging. I think that's why I've sold most of my rental properties. And now I wish I had them back because prices are so crazy and off the chart. But anyway, another story. So just remember freehold versus non-freehold. The other thing that I think's good to kind of remember for the exam, and I'll do this in a different color, is remember last week I said this can go on forever, indefinitely, where a lease has a time frame. even if it's a 99-year lease, there's a time frame involved. So anytime, these are little clues. You gotta, if I was taking flashcards or notes or different things, I would say to myself, freehold estate ownership, it can go on indefinitely. Non-freehold estate involves leases that's going to end at some time. Those are ways you can remember that. And so when you read these questions, they're going to tip you off with something like a time frame or something else. So that's how you can kind of remember those. By the way, just so you'll know, if you hear some water in the background or some noise, my wife and I do have we do grow indoor vegetables with a water garden that we have, and I never can pronounce the name of it. It's aqua something. So it's turned on now. The water turns on. Hopefully you can't hear that, but that's what that is if you do hear some noise in the background. All right, so I'm going to go over here. So a lease is an example of an estate, non-freehold time frame, right? So we remember that. And then just want to go through a couple of questions with you on some of these so that we get an idea. And I'm going to use my little pen here so we can kind of look at these. So a method of holding title, so if you see that word title, to a parcel of property wherein the mortgagor, the borrower, we're going to talk about that more, does not actually own the property, but instead has a long-term lease with the property would be, well, that would be an example of, I think, a leasehold estate. Now, it says long-term lease, but they already give us that here. I'm thinking more, and remember, freehold estate, that could go on forever. Fee simple is an example of freehold estate. And this is a classic example of the questions. They will give you questions, and you're always going to be able to get down to two choices. And this is where studying comes in. If you've studied hard, you're going to be able to pick that out, which one it is. And the other thing I want to tell you is, if you've studied hard, now, if you've really studied hard and you don't know the answer, you can always skip and come back to it later because they may answer it down the road. But if your gut feeling is telling you, I think it's that one, that's probably the correct answer. And that's what I would go with, okay? So let's see. So we're going to go with leasehold estate. If I miss any, I'm sorry, but that is correct. Okay. I've been known to miss a few as well. So we talked about fee simple estate, again, the highest form of ownership a person can have. I always love to say it's yours and you can do anything you want to it, with the exception of Uncle Pete. Now, Uncle Pete is an acronym for police power. In other words, if you own your property in fee simple, you can do whatever you want to with your property except Uncle Pete's dictation. Well, police power would be things like zoning, right? Building codes, any municipal type of regulations. You might own property in fee simple estate with no restrictions, and you want to put an Airbnb in, but the city says no Airbnbs in your location. Well, you cannot put an Airbnb in there. All right. So police power is part of Uncle Pete. I say Uncle Pete because it's like Uncle Sam, the government, right? Eminent domain I'm a creative speller, so I probably spelt that wrong. Eminent domain. This eminent domain is when the government, I'm going to draw a line over here. It's when the government takes property, it takes public property for our private property, pardon me, takes private property, your property, for public use, for the public. So this is kind of, I think would be kind of fun. Hopefully you'll think it's kind of fun, but I'm going to show you we're going to go to map of Leadington, Missouri. See if we can pull that up. Here we go. That's not a very good map there, but let's see if we can. I'll pull this one up and see if I can pull this up here. There, that's actually what I was wanting to show you, but I don't know if that'll come up anymore. Well, let's see. I had that a minute ago. Okay, this is Leadington, Missouri. So what I wanted to show you, and I'll try to draw this for you, because I was on a, oh, that's not working. So what I wanted to do what I wanted to show you was this roadway right here that you can see. I was a commissioner for the state of Missouri, and this was a highway they brought through. And there were lots of people that I knew who owned property through there. And so I'll come back over here. Maybe I can show it to you better. So the highway they wanted to put through kind of went like this, and this is Highway 67, and this is Highway 32. Well, there were homes all through this area right here. And so the state came in and they condemned this property. And they wanted to take this private property to put a highway, Highway 32. Before, people would have to wind through town and come all the way over here. And I mean, it took 15 minutes to do all the stops and the winding. And so what they were doing was building a bypass, and you could now make this in 3 minutes. And it really dumped a lot of traffic off the main drag. And so all of these people could get on Highway 32. Well, in order for this was called eminent domain. And there were 3 things that have to be met here. And by the way, this is on your exam. So I just want you to know with eminent domain, there are 3 items that need to be met. Number 1, it has to be for the good of the public. Well, you could see that the traffic was horrible over here, and it took a long time for people to get to 67. And this would really save a lot of time, and congestion would be rid of, and so forth. The second thing you have to prove is there has to be just compensation, okay? Just compensation. In other words, they have to give you fair market value. And the third item is due process. In other words, you get due process of law. We're seeing that played out right now on TV with all of this political stuff and things they're trying to do to rush everything to trial, and I'm not getting into politics or any of that, but it's not right because, you all of us need due process of law. We need to be able to hire legal counsel. We need to be able to depose people and gather evidence and prepare for what's there. And so these three items need to be present for eminent domain. And so for the good of the public, just compensation and due process. Now, during this whole ordeal here, I was a commissioner. And so they had us look at the properties and put a value on all of the properties. And many of these people had attorneys with them. Well, that's part of this right here, that due process of law. You have the right to get legal counsel. And they wanted us to give a price. Now, there were three of us who were commissioners, and I thought we gave some pretty fair prices on all of these. Now, most of these people were very upset. They thought their properties were worth a lot more. But the way this worked, and this won't be on the test, I just want you to know this process, and it does cover just compensation, was if your property was worth $45,000 back then, the state said, if you want cash, we'll give you $45,000. However, if you will buy a home in the same general area, we will give you $65,000. So in other words, they were trying to not displace the people from Leadington. They wanted them to stay in the mineral area. And so the way it worked was many of those people whose homes were only worth $45,000 actually got a check for $65,000 so long as they bought in the area. Now, if they wanted their cash and they were leaving Leadington or leaving Southeast Missouri, they only got $45,000. So most of the people went ahead and just took the higher number and repurchased in the area. But, that's how eminent domain works. Has to be for the good of the public, just compensation, and due process of law. Now, on the exam, let's take a look at this. And by the way, I just have a being just pops up. So please don't think I'm having any specific stories. I want you to make note of this, because you're going to see this on you're going to see this on the test for sure. And I just want to make sure that we get this. So this is condemnation regarding regarding real estate. Condemnation in real estate is the process. I don't know what happened to my. Oops. Well, I've messed it up there. I don't know if that will erase or not. Let's see. Let me do that. I don't know what happened to my little web thing, but we'll close that. So I'm going to go back to condemnation for real estate. We'll leave it. Gosh, now it's as small as can be. Okay. The term condemnation refers to the legal acquisition of property by local government bodies or in some states by other private entities. And it's actually the process, okay, of taking private property for public use. Now, eminent domain is, so we're gonna define, let's see. I don't know what happened here. So eminent domain refers to the power of the government to take private property and convert it to public use, referred to as taking. So eminent domain, what I want you to know for the test, and write this down, and I'm very sorry that I was so confusing here. This is the power of the government to take private property, eminent domain. Condemnation is the process. Now, you will see that on the test, and so sometimes that can get a little bit confusing. So just remember, eminent domain is the power of the government to take private property for public use. Condemnation is the process, and the process involves those three items we went over: for the good of the public, just compensation, and due process of law. You will see that on the test. There'll be a test question, but just be able to distinguish. Eminent domain is the power, condemnation is the process, and we know the three items with that. Anybody have any questions on that? My apologies if I was confusing, or I didn't mean to spend too much time on that, but I wanted you to see how that all works and why that is so important. Okay, so going back over to the board here, I need to come right over here and go back over to Uncle Pete. So again, when you own property in fee simple, you own your property free and clear. You can do whatever you want to with it unless someone's put some restrictions on it, except for Uncle Pete: police power, zoning, building codes, eminent domain, which we just talked about, and taxes. The government has the right. I have no idea why my pen is not working now. Try this pen here. Taxes. And the last one is escheat. All of these definitions you need to know. Escheat, and this is, I think you pretty much understand why taxes are being charged, and we'll get into that. Escheat is when you die without heirs and without a will. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people who die without heirs and without a will. And it's amazing to me the number of properties I've listed over my life where literally the senior citizens that I'm dealing with had no family whatsoever. It was just pitiful. Well, if someone dies without any heirs and without a will, that property escheats to the state. And so, all right, let's go over here to chapter 3, back over here. So that's what we wanted to cover on this slide. Again, the highest type of ownership a person could have in a parcel of real estate. Well, non-freehold, there's a time limit. Leasehold estate, time limit. Fee simple, that's the highest form of ownership you could have. A contract for deed, we have not talked about yet, but a contract for deed is where you're buying property and you only have what we call an equitable right, a right to get the property when you make all the payments. So Fee simple estate. Bob Jones owns a parcel of real estate. Bob dies and leaves his property to Susie Carr. Carr now owns the best type of estate one could inherit. What type of estate does Carr own? Well, again, she holds a fee simple estate. That's the best type of ownership you could have. Now, this slide, I don't want you to get hung up on this, okay? And I have to cover information in the course. But when we talk about fee simple defeasible, it's just really, and we may have talked about this a little bit last week, it's really just when someone sells property and they put restrictions on the property. I told you my wife and I purchased a pick-your-own blueberry blackberry farm, and on the farm that we purchased, the owner said we could have no businesses except for the blueberry and blackberry farm. Well, we actually, it's kind of some of you may have watched a video or two where I've talked about this, but I sold my real estate office in 2006, November of 2006, to go to work for a bank. They brought a buyer wanted to buy my real estate office. I was kind of burned out, and I thought, oh gosh, this will be great. Go to work for the bank and I'll get a regular paycheck and be off on weekends and be able to play in every charity golf tournament because, the bank's always playing all the golf tournaments. And so I go to work for the bank, sell my real estate office. And in a matter of a couple of months, my wife and I have a late spring freeze, lose our entire crop. We thought we had insurance, and because we had not owned the farm for 5 years, the government would only pay us, or the insurance company, which was through the government, would only pay us a really small amount of money. It was nothing. I signed a 2-year non-compete clause when I sold my company, and the bank I went to work for, when I went in a couple of weeks later, the auditors were there, and there were some problems with the bank. And by the end of the day, I was unemployed. I'm kind of abbreviating this story, but I'm unemployed with a non-compete clause, and we had lost our crop due to a late spring freeze. And so we literally, and I'm $1 million in debt. And as Steve Martin would say, hey kids, we're having fun now. Back when he was a stand-up comic. So anyway, I used to do Steve Martin occasionally. We got to have fun. We're studying, right? So I'm $1 million in debt. My wife and I literally, I kid you not, sold everything we had. And the bank gave us a severance package, which basically said, we'll buy the farm from you, provided you sign here and agree not to sue us, and we won't sue you. And so my wife and I sold the farm, and we moved into an apartment, but things worked out good for us. I would have never opened my real estate school had I not gone down that path. And I ended up in France selling real estate in Nice, France. I met a guy, and God was still good to me, and things worked out great, even though I felt like I was in a tunnel and a pit that I would never get out of. And so we could have maybe done some other things with the farm to have generated income, but because of the restrictions, our hands were tied. And so all we could do was sell blueberries and blackberries and pumpkins, which we did. But had we been able to host wedding venues or, do some other types of things that we thought about doing and could have done, we could have maybe made it back then. But unfortunately, that didn't work out. So what I want you to know about this specific slide is fee simple defeasible. And by the way, hopefully my audio is going. If for some reason something happens, just jump in and say, hey, John, we can't hear you, or we can't see your screen, or whatever. But right here, this is called fee simple defeasible. Let's see if that works now. no idea. I may have to exit out of this thing, and I love to draw, but that's not working. So we'll come back and I'll refresh this. But just remember, fee simple to feasible. Now, I talk about a couple of things on the next slide, and I don't want you to get hung up on this because I don't think they're going to get that in depth in the core on the exam for this. All you really need to understand is that if there are some restrictions and if it could revert back if they did something, just remember it's fee simple to feasible, okay? Fee simple absolute is the highest form of ownership. And by the way, doesn't mean anything's wrong with fee simple to feasible. It just means there are some type of restrictions. So with some, you might have to go to court, but all in all, it's not, I don't want you to get hung up on that, okay? Just understand that if there are limitations or restrictions to the deed, it's fee simple to feasible. I don't think they're going to get that in depth with conditions subsequent and fee simple determinable. If they do, the thing I always remind people is fee simple with a condition. Condition starts with a C, you have to go to court. Fee simple determinable, it reverts automatically. Again, I don't think they're going to get that detailed on the exam. You just need to understand that if there are some conditions or restrictions, it's fee simple to feasible, and I think you'll be fine, okay? But again, just condition, court, determinable, automatic, just to kind of, if you're writing notes or so forth. Now, life estates, you are going to see some questions on this. And I want to walk you through this on the board because it's not as challenging or as difficult as it may be. And if you've gone through the course, you probably saw an old video where I weighed about 50 pounds heavier. And I was discussing this, and I actually made some error at the end of the video. And I get a lot of people that say, is that correct? And that's okay. I mean, I did try to clarify myself at the end. So let's go through this and talk about it here. So I want to choose a different color here. When we talked about this a little bit last week, I think briefly, but we're talking about a life estate. And there are several players involved with a life estate. The first person we have is what we call, or who we call, the grantor. This is the person who creates the life estate. Okay? So you have the grantor who creates the life estate, and they name this person as the life tenant. Now, by the way, these questions will be in story form with lots of information and lots of details. Do not let that freak you out, okay? Because they will give you a lot of stuff that just tries to wear you down. Read through it very slowly and just ask yourself, what do they want me to answer? Because sometimes when you read what they want you to answer at the bottom of the question, it's just very easy. It's nothing too difficult. But I want you to know these are going to be in story form. So they're going to give everybody a name, okay? Now, you could have this person over here, we'll call it Randy, who is called the remainderman. And then occasionally, and I'm going to do this in a different color. Let's do this little. We could have this person over here and And this is, I hope I'm spelling that all correctly, pour atrevé, this right here. This, if we had this, it's based on Anne's life. Now, let me walk you through the scenarios here. The first one. Bob creates a life estate for Susie. This is just scenario number one, okay? In this example, and I'm just going to get rid of all of this for us here. In this example, there's no remainderment listed. Bob creates a life estate to Susie. When Susie dies, it reverts back to Bob. Okay? So let's think about this. In this scenario, Bob created a life estate to Susie. There's no remainderment listed, and there's no pour atrevé listed. So I'm signing a deed that says I'm creating a life estate, and I give it to Susie. Okay? Susie owns the property prior to her dying. Prior to Susie dying, she owns it. She's called the life tenant. She can sell the property. She could take a loan out on it, a mortgage. She could lease it. She could give it to someone. She can do whatever she wants to with it. But whenever Susie dies, whoever may have it back here loses the property because it reverts back to the grantor, the creator of the life estate, Bob. Now, I know people say, well, why would someone want to buy something like that? I don't know. I don't know why people are at the, Las Vegas right now gambling lots of money. If Susie sold it pretty cheap, and it was an apartment building with lots of income, and you thought, I'll take a risk or take a chance, you could do that. But what I want you to understand is Susie has the right to do any of these. That doesn't mean anyone would buy it. That doesn't mean anyone would give her a mortgage on it. But when Susie dies, the property reverts back to Bob. Okay, that's just a plain life estate. Now, again, a lot of these were used. For estate planning. All right, so let's add a layer to this. And by the way, tonight we're probably not going to go I'm going to try to get through this chapter, and we'll, I don't want to keep you too late tonight. I don't know, last week we went a couple hours, so, and I'm committed to helping you all out. I might throw another night through the week. If I can, I'll send an email out and you can jump on, but I'll always be recording everything for you, okay? So in this example, we have Bob, right? And who is Bob? He's the grantor. They could use that term in the question, and he's also the creator of the life estate. He's a grantor. In other words, he's granting this life estate, and he grants this life estate to Susie. And Susie is who? She is the life tenant. And Susie can do, she has all of those bundle of legal rights we talked about last week. that she can do with this property, even though it's a life estate. So what does Susie actually, she's a life tenant, she actually owns a life estate. Now, in this case, Bob says, you know, Susie, you're my daughter, and I'm giving you this farm. I want you to have it. But if anything ever happens to you, I want it to go to Randy, my other son. And perhaps I gave Randy a farm and I said, Randy, if anything happens to you, I want it to go back to Susie. Well, Randy, as we said, is the remainderman, right? So in this example, when Susie dies, the property is what we call reverts to the remainderman, Randy. And we saw a question last week that said Susie owned a life estate and died. Her property went to Randy, who was a remainderman. What type of estate does Randy now own? And the answer was fee simple absolute, right? Because the life estate's over. Randy actually owns this property in fee simple now. There's no more life estate. It's over with. And so Randy owns the property. And remember, freehold estate, fee simple, can go on forever. Now, there was this one other layer we had with Anne. And in this case, we could Susie. I was trying to, what was that? It was Susie was what I had there. In this case, Bob creates the life estate. There's two ways this could happen. Susie's the life tenant, owns the life estate. But in this life estate, Bob says, I want this based on Anne's life. Excuse me. So when Anne dies, okay, one or two things could happen. It goes to the remainderman, if that's what Bob created over here when he created the life estate. He could say, whenever Anne dies, I want this to go over here to Randy. Or the second choice is Bob could say, when Anne dies, I want this property to come back to me. Now, I used Bob and Ann here, but for estate purposes, let's just say that, let's just say in this example, this probably is a better example. We have mom and dad. And so I'm just going to put me and my wife, Carrie, and we give a property to my daughter, Alex, and we name, in this example, me. I don't know how that happened. Technology, right? I'm the pour attrivé. And so Alex, remember, is the life tenant. She owns the life estate. And in this case, what we're saying is, Alex, we've created a life estate so you can have this property. However, honey, when your father passes away or when I die, this property is going to revert back to your mother so that she can now sell it and take the proceeds and live off that after I'm gone. Or we could create this life estate so that when we die, it just automatically, a lot of times you'll see this. This is another example, is I will create a life estate and I will deed the property from me and Carrie. We will create a life estate and we will own the life estate and be the life tenants. See that? And so now we name Alex as the remainderman. I'm doing this for court purposes so you can see. So we could create a life estate and deed it to ourselves. And then whenever we die, because remember Susie, when she died, the life estate reverted back to the grantor or it went to the remainderman. Well, we just created a life estate and put our names on the life estate. And we put Alex as the remainderman so that when both my wife and I die, the property goes over to our daughter and can avoid probate and not having to go through all of that. See how that's set up? It was used a lot for those types of purposes in order to be able to get the property to who you wanted to go to after you died. But there's all kinds of ways and reasons you can do that. Today, if you have property and you own property, what you need to do, and this probably won't be on the real estate exam, I'm just giving you this information because I see so many people. You want to go to the title company and you want to prepare what is called a beneficiary deed. And on the beneficiary deed, you can name all of your children. But the beneficiary deed only goes into play after you die. And so you can remove children from the deed at any time if you want to. You can sell it without any of your children having to sign the deed. You can take a loan out on it without any of the children signing the deed. The only time the children come into play is after you die. Okay. And this is the preferred method. My mother, when she passed away in 2019, right before COVID, but being in real estate, she used to help me. She started Mayfield Real Estate. But she had all her properties in a beneficiary deed after my dad had died. And so when my mother passed away, we didn't have to go to court or probate or any of that. It just automatically came to us, and we were able to then dispose of the properties as we saw fit with me and my two children. Otherwise, what I see a lot of people do is they put their children on the deed, and then if they go to sell it, you got to have all the children come in and sign the deed. And let me tell you what, I've been selling real estate for 45 years. And I've seen some ugly situations with sisters and brothers and their spouses, and, being in the middle of a divorce or separated, and you couldn't get the spouse over there because he hated the mother-in-law anyway. Or she hated the mother-in-law. I won't just pick on men, but it's terrible. So if you have a deed and you just put all of your kids' names on there, you probably need to get that changed and just have it changed to a beneficiary deed. Okay. It's what I would suggest, and works very well. Any questions on life estates? I know that's a lot of information, but they're going to give you that in kind of a story form. And if you just kind of remember who the players are and what they do, you'll be fine. So Okay, well, good. I know that that's a lot of information, but we'll keep rolling along here, okay? Um, so that's life estate. I think the only other item, big item from this chapter, let's go over here. So again, with these, I give you all the players you can go through. And then I have a video that I think I made a mistake on. And actually, I thought I actually put an audio and corrected that. But here's a review question. A life tenant is the person who, well, do they receive the estate when the life estate is over? No, that's the remainderman. Owns the real estate? That sounds pretty good. May someday own the real estate? No, because the life tenant actually owns the real estate. Created the life estate? No, that's the grantor. So the correct answer is own. Keep in mind the life tenant owns the real estate. Now, again, just know that you own it. You can do anything that you want to with that. You very well could see some questions on the exam about dower, courtesy, homestead exemptions. And in fact, this homestead exemptions, they do like to pull a question from one of these three definitions. Homestead exemption protects the family home against, and the key words here are unsecured creditors. So in other words, if your spouse passed away and you couldn't pay the credit card payments, they cannot come and take your family home, okay? Now, that does not apply to your mortgage loan that's against your home. It's just unsecured creditors. And notice that I put a note down at the bottom. If your spouse dies and you can no longer afford to pay your mortgage payments or your taxes, you could lose your property. Dower is a legal life estate a wife has when her husband dies, and courtesy is a legal life estate a husband has. I never can remember those. So I'm looking here, dower, W, and wife. That's how I'm going to connect those moving forward. So dower, the W, and wife, W for wife, W. And courtesy, the other one goes to the husband. I do things like that. The C for courtesy and husband, B are real close together. Try to remember that. But I think that W, dower, and wife would be good for me to remember those by. Okay, which goes to a third party is called remainder. Remember the remainderman. Even though they didn't use remainderman, they like to. That's the other thing that irritates me about the test. They'll have one word and they'll have 6 different other words that mean the same thing. Which best describes a freehold estate? Now, this is a challenging question because, a freehold estate, remember, could go on forever. So it is a life estate or greater. That sounds good. It is an estate of less than a lifetime. Well, that's putting a time frame on it. It is rarely inherited. That's not right. It has a definite ending date. No, that's a non-freehold estate. So a life estate is a freehold estate. It can go on forever. If an estate is said to have an indefinite duration, it would be called well, remember, a freehold estate can go on forever. Less than freehold, that's the same as a non-freehold. Remember, I said they have 6 different words and they all mean the same thing. Less than freeholds, non-freehold. Estate for years and estate at will, we haven't covered that yet, but those also fall under non-freehold estates or less than freehold estates. So, freehold estate. A statutory right that a family has in its residence is called homestead. An owner of a life estate died and the land passed to the remainderman. What interest would the remainderman receive? Well, at that point, remember, this is one of those classic questions. they have a fee simple estate. The life estate's over, and they have a fee simple estate. Carr owned a fee simple title to a vacant lot adjacent to a hospital and was persuaded to make a gift of the lot. She had her attorney prepare a deed that conveyed the ownership of the lot to the hospital so long as it is used for medical purposes. After the completion of the gift, the hospital will own well, remember, I said fee simple defeasible, but if you can remember fee simple determinable, fee simple with a condition, they'll never include, they'll just have one of those. So I know that fee simple determinable is that specific one. So when you go back through this chapter, the most all-inclusive type of real property is, well, all-inclusive is the best, so that's fee simple. A woman owned a life estate with her son as the remainderman if she desired to sell, which would be true. Now, this is a tough question here. A woman owned a life estate, Susie, in our example, remember that? With her son, Randy, as the remainderman. If Susie desired to sell, which would be true, the buyer, Susie sold it, so the buyer would receive the same interest the seller had. That sounds good. Her son would lose his interest if she sold it before she died. That's not true. Okay? It is illegal to sell a life estate. No, we said you could do that. All parties who have any interest in the land must sign the listing agreement. Which is kind of a challenging, but we're wanting to know is which would be true. Well, the buyer would receive the same interest the seller had. That's a similar question that you might see. You won't have any yes or no questions. If Mr. Falk dies and his wife Susan is now left with several financial obligations to repay under the homestead exemption, can Susan neglect paying the lending institution where her home is financed? And no, we already knew that she has to keep making her mortgage payment. Okay, I was just going to go down here and see. I think we have two more questions. Which one of the following would not be considered ownership of real property? Would not be considered ownership of real property. Well, I think it's going to be a lease for 6 months. We'll talk about easements and life estates. So a lease is not ownership. And a life estate per autreve is one which the remainderman has died? No. The duration of the life estate is based upon the duration of the life of someone other than the life tenant. That's true. The life tenant may not occupy the property. That's false. The life tenant may occupy the property, but we're wanting to know per autreve, and so that's the correct answer. Okay.